thank you for joining us for the November the 16th, 2021 teleconference meeting of the Oklahoma City Law Enforcement Policy Task Force. We have a few announcements to make regarding the teleconference meeting. First of all, I ask that each of you stay muted until you are ready or you are recognized to speak. Task force members will be allowed to ask questions or comment at any time during the meeting. Number two, please use the Zoom hand raise feature to speak. The system automatically cues the speakers in the order their hands were raised. Keep in mind that with a large number of members on the call, we cannot always see you on screen if you physically raise your hand. Number three, if the video conference is disconnected at any time during the meeting will be stopped and reconvened once the audio and video connection is restored. If communications are unable to be restored within 15 minutes, items remaining will be placed on the next meeting agenda. The agenda and documents are all located on okc.gov. At this point, I will call the meeting to order and go to the first item on our agenda, and that would be for 21CP. Brian and Ganesha.
Thank you, MC, and good afternoon to you all. We had a bit of a break, but I'm glad to have you all back today and to get a little bit of work done before you all head into Thanksgiving, which somebody told me today is next week, and I did not realize that. So again, thank you. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to turn it over to Brian in a second. He is going to go over some highlights of the report that you have received. As you may have noted, there were some additional recommendations, but a lot of the recommendations were similar to the draft report. There was much more meat put on the bones, if you will, to give context around the outreach, around the engagement on the report. In that vein, I just really want to thank so many of you all. Many of you all showed up on the subcommittee, you showed up in the task force meetings, you showed up in the working group meetings, you showed up in the community engagement, and did work outside with community members, and additionally, held some listening sessions. And we know that you're all very busy. This is very important work, not only to you all sitting in this room, but for the people who are not in this room and are depending on us and you as representatives to make this process matter. And so what we're doing today is we're going to go over this report. As always, I encourage you all to ask questions, to, give your feedback. This is a final report, but certainly we want to hear from you all if there's anything that you feel like we didn't get right that needs to be corrected, or just any feedback. So instead of going over the entire report, like I said, because some of these things you've already seen or heard, Brian is going to go through the highlights. So any questions on that before I turn it over to Brian? Clicking through my screen to see if I see any hands. And I do not see any. Okay, so Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, and thank you. And Sharita, did you receive the PowerPoint that we were going to present today?
I do have the PowerPoint, but I cannot run it in the meeting. So I just need to know which one of you guys will want to share your screen so that we can present it.
I can take the lead on that, please.
I can.
You want me to do Jess?
Yeah, and Brian, you're going in and out on your connection. We can try for a second, but you might have to go in and come back out.
Okay, Jess, I made you a co-host.
So am I understanding correctly that Jessica, you're going to be presenting?
I'll do the share screen for you, Brian, so that you don't have to use the Wi-Fi or the bandwidth. And since we'll be sharing screen and looking at the PowerPoint, Brian, I might suggest that with all the people on here on screen, you turn off your camera while you're presenting. Since everyone will be looking at the PowerPoint, we should get better sound from you that way.
Copy that. Okay. First of all, I just want to echo exactly what Ganesha started with, which is thank you. Thank you to everyone that participated in developing these recommendations, whether they're on this call, whether they're not. This was a long, full year of work, talking to many, many people, and within the city, within the community, within the department, trying very hard to figure out within what we were asked to do, what would be the most effective recommendations for Oklahoma City under the circumstances that it is in right now. As Ganesha said, I'm going to do my best to hit the highlights of the report. The report is an 86-page report that has a whole lot of content. And we, at 21CP, we are often faced with the request, could you please do an executive summary? Could you shrink this down into a more digestible format? And historically, we've really resisted that request because the way we write reports, it's really important to read them holistically and really get a sense of how the recommendations interconnect and what we're trying to present overall as the path forward for Oklahoma City. And in particular with this engagement, because there were discrete areas that we were asked to look at, but many of those discrete areas really overlapped. It is really important that you read the whole report. And this task force in particular was asked to grapple with two critical areas, one being de-escalation and one being accountability. That being said, those concepts and issues bleed into a lot of the other areas that the working group dealt with, that we discussed in other contexts with the city and with the oversight committee. So some of the recommendations that I present here today are going to be a blend of categories, and hopefully the themes will come through in the end. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Okay, as I said, what we were asked to do is look at these 8 discrete areas. We've been over these many, many times, so I'm not going to spend too much time. Just that the law enforcement de-escalation policy, that concept really bled over into crisis response, alternative response to mental health calls, and some of the training aspects that we'll discuss later. The second area for this group was the independent law enforcement accountability to the community. This, while it was definitely focused on the CAB and how that might be reconstituted to better serve OKC, and in response to a lot of the community feedback, there were other areas that we'll touch on today in terms of the department's internal force review board and some of how it presents its internal affairs work in terms of transparency. Next slide, please. So as I said, this was a year of engagement, and this task force began before we arrived in Oklahoma City, and we did some catch up trying to figure out what work had already been done and to keep the pace moving forward. Overall, we engaged with this task force both as a group and with many of you individually. Same thing with the working group and the oversight committee. We had many listening sessions out in the community and spoke to hundreds of people about these issues. We did get the feedback through our email portal that gave us additional insight. We certainly spent some time engaging with the city and the police department, trying to understand what would work for them, what would not, where the areas of resistance might be. And we also reviewed the prior reports on homelessness and officer wellness that were done by other consultants for the city to see how those recommendations could be supported by ours and how they hopefully will all work together. We also did, we worked with the city to do a survey out into the community, and this was outsourced to a survey company called ETC. And their results are linked in our report and they're integrated somewhat. But what really jumped out at us, and I think this is incredibly important, is during that survey, we tested a few of the recommendations that we'd put into the initial set of recommendations. And across Oklahoma City, in all wards, from all demographics, in all areas, there was about 94% support for those recommendations. And why that's really, really important from our perspective is that there are many out there in any community that will say that police reform, police evolution is a radical concept that, you know, the more conservative folks within a community would reject reforms or updates to the police department. And as we said in our report, based on this overwhelming support for the recommendations we did test, is that our takeaway is that creating accountable, equitable community safety service is not a political issue. It is a practical challenge, and getting it right is important to all of OKC. And I think that's going to be important, especially moving forwards for the buy-in of the electeds in your city. So I think that was a exercise that was well worth doing, and we're very pleased that the results of that support the recommendations and the direction we're offering to you. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So jumping straight into the recommendations, because my hope is to push through this at a relatively high level and save time for your feedback and your questions. As was set out in the initial recommendations, we talked about the focus was to look at the de-escalation policy. We discussed previously that the policy itself, as drafted on paper, is actually very strong. It's mandatory. It considers whether non-compliance by any subject is due to a wide variety of potential other reasons other than resistance to the officer or some desire to flee or escape enforcement. And so that was a good starting point. But as we also talked about in our initial recommendations, the concept of de-escalation permeates more than just engagement and use of force. It really is a philosophy of the department. And what we were trying to look for were ways where OKCPD could have greater opportunities to effectively engage with the community and the subjects out on the street. And we heard, and there's a lot more in the report about the anecdotes and concepts that were advanced by the community, but consistently there was skepticism that if the policy and the training are good, why are they not seeing better results out on the street? And there's a perception that OKC can do better. And many people we spoke with pointed to OKC's position as the #2 city nationally on the chart of rate of police killing per population on the Mapping Police Violence site. It was a very clear and very raw perspective that was communicated to us, is that that the police can do better. And in engaging with the police were also very clear that they thought they could do better, and other aspects of the city thought there was room for improvement. And in fact, that's why all of this is happening. So I think there is consensus that the ball can be moved forward in this area. Recommendation number 1, we talked about previously. De-escalation is not at the highest policy level, and it really needs to be. It needs to be highlighted as a core department value. Recommendation number 2 here is actually new. When we're looking at the use of force policy, while the current policy requires officers to give warnings before using lethal force, and also requires them to provide a warning before using a taser, there are many other force options that are not included in the requirement to provide a warning. And this is one of these areas that likely goes beyond any legal mandate or requirement into what is truly best practice. if an officer has the ability to use force and it is safe and feasible, they should be providing a warning to whomever they're going to use force on. It doesn't matter whether it's a punch, a baton, a firearm, less lethal tool, any of that, provide the warning. And if possible, give the opportunity for the person to comply before the force is used. Next slide, please. And I sort of touched on this a little bit with the de-escalation, but there is this sense that the community has one perspective on how policing is occurring in OKC, and the police have a very different perspective on what they think they're doing. And there's a whole section of the report that shows, I think we call it the recent evolution. These are areas in which OKCPD has improved policy, has pushed forth practices that are designed to help the department become more effective and have better results out in the community. So certainly OKCPD has not been passive. They've been working and trying to advance best practices and improve themselves, even as this process has been going on. But the community hasn't necessarily felt those effects yet, and certainly is demanding more be done. And in the area of training, we hit on some things that I thought that I think they're really, really going to help OKCPD understand the community and how different groups within the community would like to be treated and how they would like to engage with the police. And recommendation number 5 really is that OKCPD should partner with community groups. And we actually recommended that they put out micro grants, small amounts of money, to fund organizations within the community to help generate trainings to give to the police. In other words, instead of having the police try to describe to themselves what it is the community wants, let's just have the community directly say, this is how we want to be treated, and this is what you need to know about our particular group. And I think we gave 2 examples. One was a history of policing out of Baltimore that really talked about race and its impact within Baltimore and how that intersected with policing. We also offered a training that was developed by the transgender community in Seattle to really educate the officers on this is what our community needs. But it could be any group. Certainly the indigenous peoples may want to come together and talk about what's unique to interactions with their community, and that might actually need to get down to the tribal level, because it may not be uniform across all tribal affiliations. Similarly, the deaf and hard of hearing community could benefit from explaining to officers how to interact with them. LGBTQ, you name it, any subgroup. People with physical disabilities, they may want to say, these are some of the things you need to understand about, for example, how a person in a wheelchair be restrained if they're subject to arrest, some of the concerns about that. We think that's a rich recommendation, and then the city showed an openness to engage on this. And certainly, funding is going to restrict what can be done overall, but even if it were a few micro grants per year to develop this training, that has value. And if this training is captured on video, if there are video presentations, they can be put into a bank for incoming officers as well to see. So it's not just a one and done, but it starts to build a library of resources to educate officers. I think you saw this recommendation before, so I won't spend much time on it, but there needs to be greater transparency. All officer activities, especially use of force, should be pushed out, preferably in a dashboard and raw format, in raw format, to allow researchers to go in, community to go in and play with the data and see what insights they can draw from it. And in many ways, that allows the department to crowdsource their data and get direct feedback from those sophisticated enough to do it. And next slide, please. Next slide. And next. Okay, so sliding into accountability here. I think this section was perhaps the most rewritten from the initial recommendations into the final recommendations here. And really what our takeaway and what our recommendation here is that the Community Advisory Board really needs to have, sorry, the Citizens Advisory Board, which should probably be called the Community Advisory Board. It really needs to have life breathed into it. The way it's laid out in its areas of responsibility and what it should be doing, it actually has more, it has more authority and more areas than it is currently exercising the authority to push forward. That was not well phrased. What I'm saying is it's situated to do a lot more than it's doing. And I think there's an opportunity to make sure that it can get to the full extent of what of its engagement, its review of policy, its review of training, and other parts of that. And if you look in the report, we really lay it out. Here's the current responsibility. Here are the areas where really it can engage more fully, even under the current Constitution. But then we also said, and I think this really came out of a lot of the work of the accountability subcommittee, is the city really needs to look at the membership design of this, including who's on it, the transparency of the appointments. I've heard from many people that these appointments are made in the shadows, and they really want to know who and why and what the goals were. And then almost universally, we heard established term limits. So we put in some recommendations in the implementation section about how they might go about doing this, but really just take a hard look at this and how it can be reconstituted to be more effective. We also, and I think you saw this one before, that really as this is reconstituted, there needs to be a comprehensive education campaign to highlight the work, the authority, and how the public can be involved and engaged with the CAB. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the reasons that it appears that the current CAB is not able to exercise as much influence as it is even statutorily designed to do is that it doesn't really have an administrative staff person. We heard this from community groups that they need support to actually do all of the things that they're set up to do. And we also heard from the police department that, currently professional standards is serving as sort of a de facto staff to the CAB, but even the department recognized that the optics of that are not good. It needs to be more independent. And as such, it needs an administrative staff person to provide leadership, administration, research, and technical support, and to coordinate all of the board-related activities. That clearly will require hiring someone with sufficient capabilities to do that, but we think that's important. Otherwise, you have a group of volunteers that are doing their best, and no disrespect for all the work they have done, but they need more support. And recommendation number 14, right now, the way the CAB works is that they review policies and procedures, rules, they review investigations and citizen complaints, and yet they are only allowed to really report out to the city manager or police department. That public reporting aspect of it seems to have gotten lost in the mix. And as we say in the report, one of the great powers of a board like this is the bully pulpit, is for them to call on the department to make changes. And if the department does not want to make those changes, the department can explain publicly why. And there may very well be good reasons why they don't want to make the changes requested, but it opens the dialogue up for public examination and understanding. And we think that's really important. Next slide, please. So as part of this, we looked at the policies that are out on the web from the police department. We also looked at several years of a professional standards annual report. Those had not been made public to our knowledge, but a lot of that information was put into the 2020 annual report that the department put out a few months ago. And really what was in the annual report was just stats on how many complaints they had, what the outcomes were, what the possible outcomes were, and a little bit more about the process. But what we're really recommending here is that the PD, first of all, publicly put out what is the workflow? What do you expect? If you file a complaint, this is the way it should look. And this is what you should expect. You will hear from the department in this timeline. This is how the investigation process works. And we provided a few examples of how that might look. But what's also really important is for the CAB to fully understand how these investigations play out and what the timelines are, and have greater insight into the actual operations of internal affairs, which is professional standards. So we want that publicly facing, but also to inform the CAB. Recommendation number 17, I think you saw this one previously. This is there's no way to anonymously file a complaint, and there simply needs to be. The age of requiring signatures and affirmations and going after people for filing false complaints, that's over. And I certainly have no basis to believe OKCPD is doing that. But anonymous complaints, that is pretty standard for this time in our history. So we recommend you go there. Next slide. Okay, so again, starting to get into the area of alternatives to armed response for mental health. This was a complicated area. We talked a whole lot about it in all of our engagements, and I'm not sure I put the slides in the right order here, which is why I'm hesitating. So, the primary recommendation is that, let's go to the next slide actually, and I'll come back to this one. The primary recommendation is, you have a clear demand from everyone that we talked with that there be an alternative response. There was a strong preference for the Denver STAR model, coming from many different voices within this group and the working group. And then there was we received a list of resources. These are people that could possibly work in this space, but what we didn't see was it's always possible that we didn't understand something fully, but what we didn't see was this group. We are all confident they can take on a 24/7 response to mental health calls for the low acuity calls, and and also map where the resources are that someone gets taken to if they are assisted when they're in mental health crisis. So really that led to two recommendations. One is we would like the city to create a crisis intervention committee to focus on mental health response. This really is the group of providers, people that work directly in this area, that know the ins and outs at a very granular level, coming together to help create a resource map for OKC. Here's all the resources you have, and to help guide the department and the city, depending on which entity they're interacting with, on the best way to engage with those resources and have the best policy and protocols. The second one is the city really needs to figure out who of the community groups, A, have the capacity, B, are willing, and C, have the cultural competency to do the type of engagement that the working group and the task force have been calling for. And so this is generally in the form of a request for information or a request for proposal. And the way we've laid this out is really the request for information can be informed by a lot of the work of the folks that were engaged in the task force and the working group. That can get out, and then the answers can hopefully come back to this crisis intervention committee to help the city parse through what the best of those responses are and what's best going to work for OKC. So, you know, in our report, we caution that process cannot swallow this. We really need to move this forward. But we don't think that it's going to take that long because so much of the groundwork's been done by this group to put out that RFI and then hopefully create the crisis intervention committee to help digest what comes back. Next slide, please. Or go back one. So here, you know, recommendation number 18 on the bottom there, you've seen this one before. This is really about a specific and comprehensive training plan for CIT officers. And why that's so critical is even as all of these other aspects are being developed for alternative response for the nonviolent mental health calls, or perhaps even the low acuity crime calls, there's still going to be those on the upper end where it is potentially violent or it is a crime in progress and police are going to be responding. Therefore, you can't take your foot off the gas of training officers to engage with people in crisis with the most sophisticated way they can. So, and the difficulty there is that there are trainings that need to be added in. We heard about, you know, trainings again from, you know, persons with physical disabilities, persons with mental or emotional struggles, and even, you know, for example, the deaf and hard of hearing. All of that information as to how to treat people goes into crisis and understanding. It also dovetails with that community-based training that we were recommending previously. But the whole point is that you, as a new officer coming in, you can't digest what will hopefully be a huge volume of training all in year one. So it needs to be officers coming in, get this basic level, and as they advance through their career, they get more and more information over time to help increase their awareness. Recommendation number 10, this is new. We heard a lot from people in the community about who is being hired and how do we get more people with the problem solving experience, the understanding of mental health concerns, and policing as a service. And so we threw out a recommendation here that the city consider preference points, because if you want people with mental health experience, certifications, degrees, social work experience, if those are the people you want to bring into your department, creating a preference and hiring for that makes sense to signal to them that, you know, A, that they're welcome, and B, they'll have a leg up to any concern they have whether, you know, they could do the job and be hired. So that's a way to bring more people in with that experience. 2 slides forward, please. And one more. So I'm going to move through the next few slides slightly rapidly because I've been talking for a long time and I can't even see your faces. You may have all gone off camera and gone to sleep. But these are things that were grappled with primarily by the working group, less so here, and there's less overlap with what this body was tasked to do. But looking at the law enforcement engagement with youth, you know, we talked about creating a youth advisory board that is that engages directly with the department up to and including the chief regularly. This does not mean the chief has to be at every meeting. It means that there needs to be meaningful engagement by the police department. You can't just pick an officer and send them to engage with this group. It's got to be people with decision-making authority that are vested in the success of the department and youth engagement. Recommendation number 25 was just ensure that the current programs are funded and remain a department priority, and also be part of a public information effort. We heard this is again one of those areas where we found a little disconnect, where the department really said, here are all of the things we're doing, and clearly it was a source of departmental pride, and yet many people in the community said, oh, well, we weren't aware of that. So again, there really needs to be a public information effort about what these programs are, how they work, and you know, this is something we see all over the country, is that departments are not well suited to telling their story proactively, And I think this is an opportunity to actually explain and receive due credit for the efforts they are making. We also heard a lot about school resource officers, and for us, this was the single biggest area of disconnect. We heard community members telling us about arrests, about citation, use of pepper spray in school cafeterias, that SROs were designed to be punitive and they weren't engaging the way the community wanted. At the same time, we listened to the department who told us, no, this was all redesigned with the YES program in 2018. Look at our enforcement numbers, they've dropped hugely. The use of force numbers have dropped. We've completely revisioned this. And we talked to officers with a whole lot of pride in the work they're doing as SROs, talking about how previously they felt they were criminalizing or penalizing poverty, and that just didn't help. And now they're in the business of giving food and resources and helping families to get to a position where the kids will start going to school rather than trying to be punitive over truancy issues. So two very different perceptions. And one of the things that, we looked at the contract with the school district, and it was very clear the school district wants SROs. They are the ones asking for them. And OKCPD is providing them. The contract it does stress, come in, enforce laws, enforce rules. And then, a little later down, it talks about community engagement and being role models. But I think there's a real opportunity here to revisit these contracts, to stress, the role of an SRO as a community support resource, not as an enforcer, and make it clear from a values perspective to the school district what these officers should be doing. And listening to these officers, this is what they want to be doing. So I think there's a real opportunity here to connect the dots and benefit everyone. Next slide, please. So you've seen both of these in terms of homelessness. Number 36 is, as you create these crisis intervention models, issues of homelessness should be incorporated in there. In recommendation number 37, it's OKC should consider whether to modify ordinances for quality of life crimes to individuals experiencing homelessness. In other words, you got a lot of stuff on the books. What do you want to keep? What are your priorities? And certainly what do you want, if anything, police to be doing, unless there's a violent crime involved? Within our recommendations also, we did mention that as you are creating alternative response models and a crisis intervention committee, homelessness is part of that. It's a different, can be a different kind of crisis, but it should be integrated into non-armed resources that are being deployed. So if there's an alternative response, it should tackle this area as well. Next slide, please. Okay. The Code for Officer Safety and Wellness report was actually very comprehensive, and we're really impressed with it. And so most of our recommendations here are keep on keeping on. Make sure this is funded. Make sure that you actually get the licensed professional counselors that were recommended by the Code 4 report. Do what they're telling you, because this is an area where, as everyone starts to peel apart the onion of how to improve policing, this issue of officer safety wellness really has jumped to the forefront. How do we keep officers from becoming jaded? How do we keep them from internalizing a lot of the trauma that they see and then expressing it back? And we think there's a good roadmap that was put forth by Code 4, and OKC would be well served to push that forward. Next slide. Okay, and then these are new recommendations. We looked at the suite of recommendations that we put out there, And in the report at the end, we actually detail what we think are the timelines for each of the recommendations, trying to be realistic. You know, one is a 3 to 6 month timeline, one is a 6 month to a year, and then one is, you know, over a year. And in a sense, try to triage what can be done to implement these recommendations. But there's two things that we think are going to be critical. One is there has got to be an implementation manager to ensure the sustained focus on this and to actually do the work. This person can also serve as the point of contact for questions, comments, concerns about this work going forward. But there's got to be someone that is dedicated to herding cats to make this stuff happen. And it is a hard role, so it would need to be someone that has enough capacity to manage this, because it's politically sensitive. There's a sense of urgency. This person should have a bias for action, but also needs to know how to navigate some of the complexities of the city. But without that, we've seen this in other jurisdictions. These recommendations will take much, much longer to come to fruition, if at all. And then secondly, as this is rolled out, you know, if there's any community confidence in this plan, it will only last so long. And if the community does not see progress regularly and openly, and is not informed about what is actually happening, and some of these things are going to take a little while, and certainly there will be some frustration, but to the degree the city can be transparent about what it is doing, what barriers they're hitting, and show this out publicly, say, this is our plan. And, you know, again, the staff, the implementation manager above can help manage this to ensure that it's up to date and shows what exactly is being done in response. That sort of transparency will serve the city well. Next slide, please. Okay. So those are not all of the recommendations that are in this report. There are more in there. Those are the ones that we wanted to highlight and walk you through, and they're most of the new ones, again, that you had not seen and we had not discussed in the initial recommendations. Based on that, I think I will mercifully stop talking and ask whether any of you have questions, comments, anything to offer. And Ganesha, I'll pass the reins back to you.
I'm going to go across my screen and see if there's any questions or thoughts. All right. I was wondering where Josh was. Josh, I just saw your hand. I'm going to keep going across to see if there's anybody else. Okay, I saw Josh's hand up.
Okay. So one of the things that struck me early on in reading this was that you mentioned that there are standard reforms that were not suggested because they might not fit the OKC community. And I think that was like, goodness, page 4 or something in there. And what I was wanting to know is what specific standard reforms are you referring to, and who determined that they weren't a best fit for the OKC community?
Brian, I'm going to hand that one to you.
Yep, and I'm looking to see exactly what the context of this was.
It's the second paragraph from the bottom there.
This was, I see. Yeah, this was specifically referring to conversations that we had in the working group. And what I think what was meant by this is, you know, there's a lot of cookie cutter stuff that can just be offered out of, you know, the standard playbook of police reform. And they didn't want to settle for that. They asked for a intense engagement. They went from monthly meetings to bi-weekly meetings to dig deeper into each of their areas. So really what we're trying to say there is not that there were, things that were offered and rejected, but that the working group really didn't want to be complacent about it, and they really wanted to dig in.
Okay, any other, I see somebody else's hand just came up. Josh, yep.
Garland Pruitt is waving his hand.
Okay, I saw Josh's hand up, and then I will go to Garland.
Okay.
Thank you, as always, Ganesh. It's always been a pleasure working with you throughout this process. I know that we've had kind of our one-on-one conversations, as I know that you've been having with the other groups. Is there a pulse so far on these recommendations? Are there any concerns for some that you think might not be accepted just based on the meetings that you've been having? And do you have any kind of direction on, or maybe rather opinion on whether or not some of those things that might be rejected are vital or not?
I have not had, and somebody else in 21 CP might have had a different experience. I have not had anybody outright say that they're not going, that they're going to put up roadblocks, or that there were things that were absolutely not doable. I think one of the things that was most difficult, and we talked about it, when I was there, is the subpoena power. And while that's not impossible, it's something that, is going to require, at least from our understanding, state action. So that, can be challenging. But there hasn't been anything where people have come to me and said, I think this is impossible, or we're not going to be able to do it, things like that. So, and where there were, as Brian kind of brought out, either a disconnect or where there were two sides of an issue, if you will, we kind of try to put that in the report as a beginning process. I think, you all made it very clear, and quite frankly, I agree with you all, that now is the time for action. While there is a lot of room for more conversation, if necessary, it needs to be coupled with action. What's going to happen first? And so even if there are some of those folks who, pop up after the fact, who didn't say anything before, it still should be predicated on, let's work on this right here. There is plenty in the report to start working on right now. And then, we can tier step it out for the ones that, are going to cause all these issues, and continue to talk about that. Does that answer your question, Josh?
It does. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. All right. I think Garland was next.
Yes. Did we have a number, or how will they actually select that youth advisory board? How will they be selected? Is there a number? And a follow-up beyond that is, and how soon will we be able to implement any of these particular recommendations that we're going through right now? Say, boom, okay, we've got the reform, got the recommendations. How quick, fast, and in a hurry will we have the implementation of this process?
So I'm going to answer a couple of things, but some of those things I think are on the city. So we did not make a recommendation of how many youth should be on. What we're hoping is that this concept is taken, and a process is put in place. We spoke to several groups, I'm sure that you're aware of them, that are already working with young people who are interested and motivated to make change as it relates to police community relationships. And so I think there's a great groundwork also with the programs that are already out there. So I think that that's something that you could probably take action on right away. You will note that in the report, and I really push this because, as you all know, I've had to implement reforms in different police departments. It is a lot of work, particularly with government and the bureaucracy and the red tape and all those sorts of things. And so we suggested that one person be, you know, appointed or hired to usher this work forward. And so, you know, if the city decides to do that, then, you know, the implementation timeline will, you know, come along with that. Also, there are some of the things that have budget implications. And so we have recommended also that the city sit down, and there are some things that we talked about timing, but, you know, there's gonna have to be put more meat on the bones as far as the timing goes, and then make sure that it is very public facing, the timeline, whether they're meeting the timelines, and things of that nature. So to me, there's things that you can start working on right away, but there are things that have to be timed out, and the city has to be, you know, open and communicate that to the public. I don't know if the city wants to say anything in response to Garland's question.
Sure, I'll speak into that, Ganesha. So, you know, for us, it's exactly what Ganesha, I was going to answer kind of along the lines Ganesha was talking about, with the idea of either a contractor or hiring someone to be an implementer for us to help put together an implementation plan that we can begin to work. I don't think that slows the progress. There's some things that we can begin to work on, you know, some of the policy issues. We've already started some of the discussions on a couple of the topics with the FOP in contract negotiations, and are trying to decide how best to manage that process right now. So some of these will continue moving on, but I do think getting an implementer in place, someone that can help us really manage this process, is going to be key to us being able to move forward. But I think there's a few of these that, you know, we incorporated into our budget this year on looking at the alternative mental health response. So trying to get things moving on that fairly quickly so that we can get the group involved that helps to advise us on how we approach that, and the process and the method that we use. So I think there's several things that we can get moving, implementing fairly quickly, but, you know, kind of a first step for us will be getting an implementation manager in place to be able to help manage the process for us to work through this.
So do we have a time frame on that implementation person?
Yeah, I don't right now, because I want to evaluate this and look at the options we have of contracting. We'll put together a vacancy announcement, get ready on that if we decide to move that direction. But I know there's some contractors, some folks that are out there that can help contract with this. So I want to evaluate that. I would hope by the end of the year that we're ready to make a decision on which direction we're going to go with that. We've worked through this. We know where we're going to go with it. And if we're going to advertise it to fill it within, or try to find someone through an RFP process to contract. So we would get moving on that fairly quickly.
Thank you.
Perfect. So I think Grace was next.
Hello, good to see everyone. Hello.
Hey,
I had a question about, y'all know what I'm about to ask, or what I'm going to ask about. In the recommendations, I read that about the alternative response, mental health response. I did notice that the pilot was not included. And an example of that is, you know, I see the recommendations for the RFI to get the public information, to see the resources. I see the discussion about that the people need to be capable to handle logistics and be culturally competent. But the language in there does not say that that needs to happen before the pilot that is being funded by the city. It doesn't say that. It kind of infers that we need to move forward, possibly, and somebody could interpret that even before those things are done. So my concern in the language around that recommendation is that it's not saying it needs to, you see what I mean? Does that make sense?
It does, it does. So Grace, you know, we really grappled with this, and I'll come to Brian around the language, because you bring up a really, really good point. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our thinking, and then we'll think through the way to deal with this. So we really grappled with a couple of things. One, you know, there were on the working group, the task force, and then, you know, so many community members in their own time came together to really talk about and think about what was necessary in Oklahoma, in addition to, you know, reaching out across the country and looking at different models. I think what ended up happening as Brian looked at the information was there was not a clear path on which providers could provide all of the things that need to happen for the different populations in Oklahoma City. Also, there was the question around 24/7 response. Also, a variety of things with the a connection with dispatch. There was a lot of things that still need to be worked out. And so generally an RFI is very different than an RFP. An RFI really goes to request for information. Who is out there who can do the things that we have put together to say we think we need in this project? So to me, while I agree with you, it is not clear in the report. This could happen one of two ways. One is you all have done so much work and research that a pilot could be either done in parallel or with an RFI or to inform an RFI. So what you're actually doing is, yeah, you looked at Cahoots and you looked at Denver and you looked at different models, but actually bringing that implementation on a small scale to Oklahoma City, you might see some cracks. You might see some, you know, different things that you might want to change in a different way. The calls for service may be different. The volume may be different, different things like that. So the pilot can inform the RFI, or the RFI can go in parallel with the pilot. So you want to make sure that by the time you get to an RFP, or you're getting to a point where you are actually funding a program, you have all of those things worked out. And the second thing I want to say is there was a conversation between putting together this committee to help usher this work. Jessica really uplifted in the conversations, you know, all the work that has already been done. And so that we do not want to prolong the process of putting together a committee and all those sorts of things. And here we are a year, 2 years out. We believe that the work that you have done is enough to start sitting down, having conversations and putting meat on the bones. And the way that the committee that we mentioned in the report should be set up is a follow-on to make sure that things are sustainable and you're thinking about the future and how this project and this work can grow. So I know I talked a lot, but let me just summarize where I think, and we might need to clean up the language. You can do both, and the work that you all have started is a great springboard to start to just move right into continuing that conversation and to starting that work.
So Ganesha, if I could add into that too, just in your response, that I feel like too that we need to be able to analyze the data that we have from 911 calls. And right now, there's a couple of things on that. And part of it gets into the recommendations that are there. One of them is that the data that we've got right now on 911 calls, because we take those, the way we take those calls, a lot of the information on if it's a mental health call is in the notes. So it's a more manual process to analyze. And so one of the things we've looked at is, you know, possibly bringing in a consultant to come in and digest that, pull all that data out for us to help us analyze that, to be able to determine which calls, you know, to set those protocols for which calls would be an alternative response. And the other one is, so that's part of this, working with that advisory committee. The other part of it is that I agree with you 100% that whatever we do when we start here, as we get started, is going to be it will be a pilot program to start, knowing that we're going to evolve that program as we learn lessons from that response. And so I know that's part of what we'll be doing, that it may be that we clean up the language in this, but definitely how we start this will be with a pilot program.
Okay, and let me just say this on that. to start the pilot program, there's some information that we have that we can use that could be used to start the pilot program. One of the concerns is that we don't want to prolong a pilot that could be up and running sooner than later by looking for additional information that, you know, the way that we hold the data or receive the data, like with 911 calls, isn't there. But there is some information there that can guide us in the pilot. And with that, we want to make sure the wording in the recommendation is that the pilot doesn't go forward without the pilot doesn't go forward without the community, those mechanisms that is important to have in place with the transparency and everything else. So my concern particularly is that wording is not in place, that part of the recommendation is not very clear. And that, you know, maybe it needs to say in the recommendation that, you know, a pilot program would be, is about the growth, right? Is about the growth and the learning and the growing, but every inkling of information is not needed to start the pilot. We have enough. There is enough. It could be said that there's enough to get to the pilot sooner than later. We just don't want to prolong anything. And we want to make sure those mechanisms where it's transparent, open to all the community, all the information is getting done, all of that occurs as well before the pilot starts.
And Grace, what I mean, I know you have plenty on your plate, but I mean,
absolutely not. Whatever.
Okay, well, you're critical. You're a critical bridge to this conversation. This can't be the report that's handed to the city, and then Grace goes back to all the wonderful work she's doing, and the city goes that, you know, you did work. You know, and you and Josh, I mean, there was work that was done even with all of the community members that you all met with and talked with. That knowledge transfer needs to happen with the city. So, you know, in my opinion, what needs to happen is, and again, it would be ideal if there was a person that was already set to move this work forward. But in the absence of such, you know, I don't think initial conversations between you and the city for that knowledge transfer to happen, for the city to talk about, because any liabilities or any worries that they have, y'all need to still have that conversation. So you know where they're coming from, they know where you're coming from, and what a pilot has to do is, while I know you can't have everything in place, it needs to be clear about what you're trying to figure out, the metrics that you're going to measure, the baseline, and if you need 10 things, are the 4 things you have enough for the pilot, or do you need maybe one other thing to get to 5 to start the pilot? You may not need 10, but you may need 5. That conversation, I think, still needs to happen, and it can't happen just from us handing the report over. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay.
No, that makes sense.
Okay. And I will say, one of the things, you know, and I'll say it, you know, out loud here on the recording, that was very, very important, and we hope that we uplifted it the way that we needed to, was the need for the community, particularly the communities that are affected, to be part of this conversation. You know, it's going to be set up for failure if that's not what happens. And so, but then there also has to be mechanisms for the fact that some of those communities have been and still are part of a systemically racist system. And so the conversation has to be, there is a certain level of service that we absolutely have to give the community, but we can't leave out the community who needs it the most from the conversation just because the systems up to this point have kept them from bringing up that capacity. So that has to be, and I think that this space is ripe for the most work to be done, because out of everything that we did in this report, This is where the police and the community 100% agree. Things need to be done better and they need to be responsive to the community needs. The question is how to do that. And I think y'all are in a good space to continue that conversation. There doesn't have to be anything that's prolonged, but there are a few more conversations that have to be had so that you all have a responsive pilot. Okay, I see several hands that have gone up. Josh, is your hand still up from the last time? Or is that a new?
No, it's for a new one. So I would go ahead and go to everybody else first.
Okay, beautiful. Okay, thank you. So I think Ed was next.
Yeah, thank you. And first, let me just say to Ganesha, to you and to Brian and Jessica, thank you for the amount of work in the report. And I think you referred to earlier, putting flesh on the bones. You did a great job of putting some really good flesh on the bones for us, and we appreciate the work that you all have done. Just a quick question for you all, and then one for the city manager. In the chart that you all have in the back, where you outlined the recommendations, the description, and then budget dependencies and so forth, and then you have potential barriers. I didn't see any designations or any reference to some of these recommendations requiring a conversation with the FOP. Was that intentional, or is that something you would have to go through the contract to determine whether or not they would be required in conversation, some of those? And then the follow-up on that for the city manager, where are we at in conversations contract-wise with the FOP? Where are we at in the contract? When does it expire? And if it's down the road, is there a way to bring some of these things into conversation sooner than later? I'm tagging onto what Garland talks to us about all the time, not delaying things, but getting things moving forward as quickly as possible in some areas where we can. Where are we at in being able to have some of these conversations with the FOP and move forward on some of this?
So I'll let Brian speak to that, and then we'll go to city manager.
Yeah, and it's a great question. And we thought a lot about this. So timelines and barriers to implementation is section B of overall section 5. In there's also a section called the Fire and Police Arbitration Act and OKCPD unions that sort of explains the process of collective bargaining and what is and what is not required. But in there, in discussions with the city, we felt we would do them a great service if we highlighted this is a bargainable issue, or this one has to be, this clearly implicates wages, hours, and other working conditions such that it cannot move forward without the union's blessing. Those are arguments that the union is going to have to advance and the city is going to have to respond to. And if we pre-identify it, all we could do is disadvantage the city in those sorts of negotiations. So we decided not to. We simply flagged it as, yes, this is hovering in the background and it's going to be really important, but we can't decide it for you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and then to the question of where we are with negotiations, so the current contract actually expired on July 1st, and that because our contracts run on the fiscal year and our fiscal year is July 1st. So the contract expired July 1st. We did an extension of the existing contracts while we work through negotiations still. There's a few issues that are out there that we're still working on. And so we're still in the process. The one that we got on there right now is the body cam, the reviewing of the body cam video. That's still in our negotiations. It's in that contract proposal. We're in discussions with the FOP right now. The possibility is to keep that in there as part of our last offer, or to pull that back and negotiate that away from the contract negotiation table. That there's other issues that we need to work through on body cam videos right now with new technology that's being implemented. So there's some issues around that one. The other one that I think is in there too is the reducing the amount of time that's there for officers to have prior to the interview. We don't have that on the table currently. It'd be something we still have to approach the FOP on to get an agreement on that.
is there a process just in the way that you all deal with the FOP here? If you arrive at a contract by the end of the year, whenever, is there a way to go back and have conversations during the contract period about these other things outside of the actual negotiation period, or are we going to have to wait until the contract comes up again to be able to talk?
No, we absolutely can do that. And the department and the FOP work together on issues relating to policies all the time offline, and they'll do an MOU in between. The chief is on, John, George are on. So if either one of them want to jump into that and correct me on anything that I've said, I'm glad to have that. But yeah, we definitely have the ability to continue with negotiations and deal with it from an MOU standpoint that would then roll into the next year's contract, but would be implemented at the time that the MOU is signed by both parties.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So,
Thank you, Ed. So I'm sorry I didn't see whose hand went up first, but I'm going to go to Reverend Dickerson and then go to Joanne.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to echo the sentiment of gratitude and thanks to all of the team of consultants that have been tireless in helping us literally, I guess, put a bow on everything. Some of the questions that I had, Grace's follow-up actually hit, but one of the things that that Mr. Freeman said, I want to make sure this is a point of clarification. Were you saying we would hire a consultant as far as basically kind of scaling down the statistical data? That concerns me because that seems like that would be another prolonging of getting everything started if we've already established that we have enough for a pilot program. And is that necessary? Is that a step that we need? Hiring another consultant, using those resources when we could really put that into beginning the pilot program? That's my first preliminary question.
do you want me to take that, Ganesha?
Yeah, I could clarify, but I'll let you go ahead.
No, you go ahead and clarify there. I want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
Yeah, and just make sure that I'm saying this right. I think what you were saying is that you wanted to do some analysis of the 911 data, but that you were not going to use an outside consultant to do that. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, so what I had said was what we have found is the data that we have, 911 data we have, there's some of it that comes in the first part of it that actually goes into the data that you can pull out of the system that indicates if it's a mental health call. But a lot of times calls are mental health related calls, but they don't come in as that. And so because in our system right now, one of the recommendations is that as we go to a new information system to get a more, a broader expansion of the amount of data that we're collecting on mental health calls, because the 911 system was set up that it's taking it as emergency calls, not as mental health calls, and having stronger base of information that's there, that's available to be able to pull information straight out of the system is going to be important to us long term, so that we can continue to analyze this and how we're doing our responses. A lot of what happens, as I understand the system, Chief, you can correct me if I'm saying something wrong on this, but a lot of what happens right now that gives us more detail on a mental health call happens more in like a notes section. So it's, as opposed to being something that can be analyzed with data more easily, it takes more effort to put that in there. One of the things I would like to see us do is to get better information, because better information from those mental health calls, because the challenge that we're talking about with being able to send someone out on a call right now, we send a police officer on every one of those calls. I don't disagree that there's some calls that we could send an alternative response rather than the way we're doing it right now. But talking about individual safety as we're going into this kind of new process, new methodology, new way of responding, because we're doing this, I want to make sure that we're doing it right and we're not jeopardizing anyone's safety in the process. So that's why I was saying I felt like I might need Ganesha to answer that first question. we might need some additional analysis so that we can set those protocol when a 911 dispatcher could send the alternative response as opposed to sending the police response. So I want to make sure we can evaluate that, not in the sense of trying to delay this in any way, trying to move it ahead, but making sure that we're doing it in the right way.
But not hiring a consultant to do that.
To analyze the data, possibly.
Oh, okay. Brian, do you have something, any insight on that? I know you've been studying this for a while.
Yeah, and this is one of those situations where you're often, trying to design the plan while you're flying it. There are calls that within the existing 911 data that could be offloaded and referred to that for an alternative response. So if a pilot, if you can identify the resource to do the pilot work, no reason that can't move pretty quickly to test what's working and what does not. Safety is always a concern, but with good protocols at the 911 center, most jurisdictions have found that they do not need to call for police backup because they're being cautious with what they're being sent to in the first place. So there is some work to do around that. I think you are absolutely right, Craig, that in order to really get this right, you're going to need to dig into the data. You're going to need to gather different data, and you're going to need to analyze how this pilot and then ultimately the system as it gets scaled up, how it's working, and it's going to have to be changed and modified many times along the way. But in the report, we strongly recommend a bias for action. So even if there's only a small thing you could do now, even getting that moving is worth doing, even as you perfect the systems moving forward or design them in a more sophisticated manner. So it's in my mind, it looks like a whole bunch of parallel tracks. Does that resound with you?
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I think there definitely is parallel tracks. I would like to talk with you some more on like the protocols that other cities are using right now, that we look at those so that we identify those lower level calls that we know are not a risk or a high risk. But definitely, I think some of this can go on a parallel track.
Okay, and I think that was a preliminary question. Was there one more? Did you have another follow-up to that?
That actually, all of those combined did hit the secondary question that I had. So thank you. I'm still feeling a little apprehension or tension around what seems like it could be delay, unnecessarily delay. And I'm not debating the fact that there may be a need for that, but we're still having so many issues that having a program that is already activated could resolve. I'm not trying to get the cart before the horse, but I'm also trying to prevent us having any other calamitous events that definitely could be avoided with all of the work that has already been done.
Yeah, and I think the balance there, Brian is working on this around the country. So am I. I'm working in Albuquerque. They are actually implementing the first cabinet level all civilian response team that is on par with fire and police. And they're starting with a very limited amount of calls. And that's what you're really seeing around the country. And even when you look at Cahoots, I think they've been doing this for 16 some odd years, right? So certainly they started in very small. And then on the flip side, of course, you all know if something goes wrong, people are going to sue the city. They probably won't even sue the community-based organization because who has the big pockets? The city does. So, there's going to be concern there on liability. So that's why I think, when Brian says a bias towards action, what has to happen is these continued conversations. Where can we meet in the middle and know that we have to get, there is still a lot of pain in the community from, some very loved folks that were lost. That people feel like had there been maybe a different alternative response, that folks will still be alive. So that's still very much in the conscious of folks in the community. So I think it's, best to continue to have these conversations so you can figure out where you can meet in the middle. And one thing, and we've said this to the city, and y'all know I've said this to when I'm meeting with the community. What has to happen after a report is continued communication and action, or else all the goodwill, all of the work that has been done up to this point can very easily be dissolved. So I appreciate you all for lifting that up. I'm gonna go to Joanne next and then Dexter. Sorry, Dexter, and then I'll come to you, Josh. Sorry, go ahead, Joanne.
Okay, Mr. Freeman kind of talked about having an implementer either through a possible contractor. And I've got a little bit of a problem with that because when you hire a contractor, normally they can't influence what goes on with recommendations. You already had the recommendations. You've already contracted the what. Now the question becomes the how. If you have a city employee whose job is to implement these recommendations and to give not only, of course, the management the recommendations or how they should go about doing it, but it's also to keep the city the city as a whole, the citizenry, informed. And so I'm just wondering, why would we go that route when it would be easier just to hire an employee who would be the implementer, who would also have the authority to make those changes? I'm just kind of asking that question.
Yeah, I think you make good points there. I don't disagree with what you're saying, that anyone coming in, if you come in as a contractor, one of the first things you'd have to do is you'd have to learn the city, you'd have to learn the organization. But also, if I bring someone in as a new employee, they're gonna have to learn the city, learn the organization. But I don't agree, I don't disagree with you. I just want to make sure I look at it to see what I feel like fits our situation best. I would say I would probably lean more towards a project manager that's internal to the city right now, but I'm leaving that door open that we may look to see if there's a contractor that we think would fit our organization, that we think would fit our community, that would be able to come in and do a good job to help us implement that. So I want to keep that door open, but I think you're right in what you say with trying to manage within a large organization and a bureaucracy within a government organization is more difficult from an implementing standpoint from the outside than it is from the inside. So I understand that.
Okay, perfect. Joanne is always going to keep us on point about those contracts. So let's go to Dexter next, please.
Thank you. I just had a brief comment for Reverend Dickerson. I was just going to say, you're always going to have issues with, whether or not the call is a mental health call or not, because it's based on what the call taker receives, which is not always accurate information. But to answer her question, I can't find it in the recommendations, but there was a recommendation about receiving better or more specific intel information on a call to direct calls, and that could address her issue, where if a person had a particular issue, such as being deaf or something of that concern, to notify the responding officers, that would help them determine who they're going to send to that call. So if she was concerned of having officers respond to her call when she didn't necessarily want officers to respond, that would be one of those situations where you might list particular information for a non-lethal response.
Thank you for that, Chief Nelson. That was part of my concern, as well as part of the intent and our efforts are trying to establish a different level of trust and literally bringing a more cohesive rapport between law enforcement and community. And we have so much work to do. I know that if we're not being very, very intentional in addressing the most impacted communities as at large, then we literally will be taking steps backwards and causing more of a deficit. And then we'll lose even more community faith. They're already kind of skeptical because of the timing, and I understand how long this process has taken. And none of us were trying to literally retard things. But if we start infusing programming that one isn't really serving the community, then we're really working for naught. So that was my concern. But I do thank you for that, Chief Nelson.
Yeah, and just to double down on that, it's in the report, but we're so very thankful for parents who spoke out with autistic children and family members, as well as we had folks on calls who not only worked in the mental health field, but also had family members who suffered, and then also really are, and I'm going to say deaf and hard of hearing, and I've heard that both offend folks, so I apologize, but we had great input from that community, and so all of these things I think need to continue to be uplifted as we put together these programs to make sure that they're responsive to all folks in Oklahoma City community. So I'm going to go, I think, Tim, you're next.
Okay, as long as it wasn't Joshua, I know he.
Yeah, I think Josh is letting me call on people who haven't spoken yet,
Okay.
and then I'm gonna go to him.
Okay, so I think I've got two, and I think the first one may be your easiest question yet. I looked through the PDF and I even did a search. I can't find the link to the survey.
I don't know that we put that in there, but
Oh, okay.
Brian, do you want to speak to that?
We only put in sites to the PDF sections of the survey that we have. To my knowledge, there isn't a link at this point, but we're working with the city on that. And we can replace that once that's in public forum.
Sorry, I misunderstood that. And then I think this is a little different than what Bishop Ed asked before, but on some of the first, on the timeline and the barriers, like even just the first 2 or 3 through 5, where you're talking about requires council vote, is that because they deal with collective bargaining? And so to change it would, because I guess it, like the first one, de-escalation policy should be elevated. Is that not something the chief can do on his own?
It is not, from what we understand, is that when it's at the policy level, it actually requires council input on it. And this has actually been a barrier for the police department in the past, in that there are things that they want to be more flexible and pass quickly. So they've been doing it at different levels, doing it at the procedure level or doing a chief's directive to get quick action on it. So that's where that comes from.
Okay, great, thank you. I mean, not great. I think that hinders the chief, but I understand the answer to the question.
Agreed, Tim, agreed. All right, Josh, we're coming to you.
So I guess because I might have been under, or I might have misunderstood in some earlier meetings with both task force, but mainly with the working group. I guess the question is for Mr. Freeman. So I was under the impression, and I think a lot of us were, that there was $300,000 set aside for a mental health alternative response pilot. And that's the way it was talked about, certainly in the working group meetings and in other conversations that we had. And what I'm wanting to know is that actually for a pilot program, I guess, partially, and then secondly, because we never, myself and Grace in our presentations, we never talked about, even though we asked the Denver Star folks and others how much upfront capital they needed to get their pilot program started, which was far less than the 300,000 number in a city that's more expensive. So I also want to know, where did the number 300,000 come from? That is, who informed like that number, $300,000 is what would be needed. Who gave that sort of like input?
Yeah, so the $300,000 is in the budget, as you stated. We actually had $1.3 million in total that we had in for, we have several. We had the Human Rights Commission task force, and we had the homelessness task force, and then we have the law enforcement policy task force and the working group. We wanted to set aside some funds, and really the numbers that we used, we had the $1 million in there. We had the 1.3 million. As we were going through and managing our budget, looking at what we felt like we had flexibility to add when we were trying to restore some services that have been eliminated, we used $1.3 million, what we arrived at. Because we were on such a clear path that this needed to happen with the mental health response, it seemed like everyone was in agreement, this is what we need to do. We pulled out $300,000 to show that we're dedicating that to mental health response, that is a start. The idea that it's the pilot program is we know that won't be enough to fully fund. I mean, the 1.3 million probably won't be enough to fully fund a fully functioning program, but to give us a start in that program to begin, pulled aside 300,000. It's not a magic number, but pulled aside 300,000 to be able to say, hey, this would give us the ability to initiate a program.
Okay, but what I mean is, where did the number like come from? Like $300,000 is kind of a magic number, which is, you know, it's not based on anything. That's why I'm wondering.
No, that's what I'm telling you. It's budgeting. We don't know everything that would be involved in it. And we said, we're going to at least put $300,000 in there, just like as an approximation for putting a team, to be able to put a team out on the street. It was an approximation.
Okay. All right. And I guess just as a follow-up to what we were discussing just a bit ago with the stats concerning mental health calls, what are we to think about? There's a chart on page 14 that is the total mental health calls since 2014. And the department reporting that there's been a 58% increase in the number of mental health calls for service between 2014 and the present. I don't, in hearing the discussion that just took place about how we don't really know what constitutes a mental health call, or whether there's a lot of discrepancies in there, I'm wondering, what does this data actually mean? That is, is this data coming from the 911 call center? Is this who classified these mental health calls? And if they're not specifically classified, how could that information have even been presented?
So Brian, do you want to take that one initially, and then I've got a follow up, I think.
I mean, yes, my understanding is that these were the calls that were identified by the department as mental health calls for service. I believe, and perhaps Chief Gourley can correct me if he knows, or someone else, or give me a moment to get back into the annual report, but I believe this is the after the fact assessment. Because a call comes in as one thing, and then it ends as something else sometimes. And I believe this is the hindsight analysis of what constitutes a mental health call. Chief, do you know if I'm correct on that?
We have documentation on the confirmed mental health calls that we know resulted in some type of initiated action that was related to mental health. We know that through our RMS system, where we're pulling the reports, and the CAD calls that were originally generated. Where the confusion comes in, and there's no way to accurately validate without digging deeper into the data, like the city manager said, is there are calls that start out, for example, as a disturbance, as a burglary, as a trespassing call, or anything like that, that wind up being mental health. If it generates a case number and generates a report, and that report is tagged as a mental health call, then we'll catch that, we'll capture that. There's times though that they go out there and they're dealing with a person who may be in some type of dealing with a mental health issue, but they don't meet the criteria to fall under that state guideline of a mental health person in crisis that we're going to have to transport somewhere that's going to generate a case number. Those are the type of incidents that we need to identify that could result in some type of alternative response where someone could go out there and possibly deal with that in a different manner, instead of the officer going out there and going, well, there's nothing we can really do here, or our only option is to take this person to jail for trespassing or whatever the situation is, to try and alleviate the problem that's going on there. And that's the type of data that we're not going to have. The information that you're talking about, Josh, is what we've confirmed. We know it generated a case number, it generated an incident, and we track through our mental health, our CIT coordinator, we track every one of those calls, and that includes our transports between facilities around the state. So that's the numbers that you're talking about.
So is there, and Chief Gurley, just a real quick follow-up, is there any way to get like a percentage of how many of these calls started as mental health calls versus finished in hindsight?
I probably could, but I have one person that tracks that data on those confirmations and also applies for the reimbursements from the state. And it would be very time consuming for me to go back and have them look at every single call and see what started out as a mental health call. I couldn't give you a percentage of that, but I could tell you that what you have to think about too in this is, being realistic in this joint response. That's what it means, is a joint response, that I think a lot of these are going to be initiated not only by that initial call, but what's really going to help us in law enforcement is when that officer goes out and assesses the situation and realizes there's really not much I can do here, but then they can call one of those teams over to help and hand that off. I think that needs to be part of what we're looking at as well. And that's what we're doing right now with North Care, and we're working on, I think we'll have a pilot here very soon with the grant that they've got working, and they're looking at already purchasing equipment, hiring people, and putting them out there. And I think how this is going to start is going to be this assessment type of us going out and seeing, okay, this is not for us, we're going to hand this off. And then as we move into that, that's going to help us identify what those calls are, because there are going to be calls, to give you an example, in that category too, where someone's going to call in and go, hey, my son, family member is off their medication. They're not violent, but I'm really trying to get them back on their medication and need some help doing that. That's not a police call. We can send somebody else out on that. So those are the kind of things that we're going to have to look at and do our research on and identify. But I think starting any pilot, I think that's where you start, because it makes those providers more comfortable too, because the folks that we're talking to that work in this area, they don't want to go out on these calls by themselves initially either. So I think, in our community, this is all new. So we're going to have to kind of start dipping our toes in the water a little bit and moving forward with that. And again, what the city manager's saying about being able to extrapolate that data and really look at that, that's going to be very helpful, because we don't want to put a dispatcher in a position of sending someone to a call that winds up getting them hurt. And then, they're going to feel like they're responsible for that. So I feel like we're headed in the right direction. There's a lot more that's been happening than I think people realize. People look at it and think, well, we don't have this response going right now, so we failed. But the fact that we're even talking about this and moving toward this, to me, is huge, because in 32 years of law enforcement, I've wanted something like this. I know every police officer has, and we haven't been able to get the backing and the support, not only from the community, but from Department of Mental Health and others. And I feel like we have that now, and we have a lot of things in place. And I think, you guys are a big part of that as well, of that success to even be where we're at right now.
And also, thank you for that, Chief. And also, these are the types of things that you want to note in a pilot, right? So where you wouldn't want to pause a pilot because you want to go and look back at all of that data, because you have very limited resources, you might want to say, but it would help us refine, what we're going to do moving forward if we start tracking those things. So with that extra money, Josh, maybe that's part of what can go into laying the groundwork for these things. So I see also Joshua Harris Teal's hand up.
I know, thank you so much for calling on me. I know that we have been talking about kind of the different levels of items in the recommendation. ones that the chief of police could do immediately or was within his power or within the city manager's power, the level that had to go to the city council in order to have their approval, and then even broader, that level that had to go to the state in order to get approval of those. And I don't know if Chief or City Manager Freeman wants to speak to these. Of those kind of lower level tiered items, are any of those already accepted or in the process of being accepted? And then what's the strategy for letting the public know that these new policy changes are going into effect or have gone into effect really soon, so we can show the community that, one, obviously there were some immediate successes, there's some things that are on the horizons, and there's of course some challenges in the future that we need to address.
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think, and then I'll let Chief tie in if you want to, but I feel like, a couple of things on the, looking at some of our policies that we can work through, like escalating, putting the de-escalation into a policy. So it's not just seen as a procedure, but it's clear that it's a policy and it's one of our primary policies. Some things like that, I think that we can move on fairly quickly, and that we can note that, we can do a better job of rolling that out and doing a press release, a community release of information to make sure that we're notifying the public when we are taking some of these steps that we're actually working on. So some of those policy issues that I think we can work through, even though with some of them they'll have to go back through council, I feel like we can move those fairly quickly to work back through council and work with the FOP on those to be able to move forward.
Yes, and these processes are already in motion. We're currently, we started moving forward about, I think it was a little over a month or two ago, in revamping how our policy manual is structured and doing just those things that Brian was talking about. It was based off the initial recommendations that we got before we even got this final report. So that's already in the process and working. We already have the policy in place, or the procedure in place. So all we have to do is transfer that to the policy level. That's an issue that is not time consuming, and that's easy to do. One of the biggest things, I believe, if I remember right off reading the report, the sanctity of life directive that I have, it's already written, and it's been in place for quite a while now, and it just has to be transferred into our manual. And it's the same with a chief directive. We're held to it the same as we are any policy or procedure. And so that's already there and in place. And it's just a matter of going through the process to move that in. And so theoretically, that one's done too. So there's a lot of things like that I think it's just about going through the government processes that we go through to get them done, but they're really already in place anyway. They're already functioning. It's just a matter of semantics and where they're located.
And I think, Josh, to your point too about, like our strategy for how we'll communicate this, I think we do need a specific strategy around this. I mean, we do community releases or press releases, but making sure that we're first communicating to the broadest group of the public that we can reach, but also that we're making it clear it's part of what this task force brought forward. It's, it's part of the work that's being done through the community task force. And so I think for us, it's making sure that we're rolling those out in a little bit different way than we do other press releases, so it gets the notice, and that we make sure that we're pushing it out with social media and other forums as well to make sure we're communicating to as broad an audience as possible.
And the other thing that we've spoken about, Josh, too, is making sure that there is something on the website that is easily accessible for you to see progress, and also considering public forums, and then certainly, obviously, keeping you guys up to speed, not only on the things that you're not directly related working with, but all of the things that have come up in the task force. And that was one thing that, came up quite often with the chief when we would talk about different things we heard from the community. And he would say, well, we're doing this, well, we're doing that. And so one of the recommendations, not one of the recommendations, but some of the context we added to the report that might not be as obvious, because there's so much there, is an absolute need to over communicate. you know, because there are things that are going on that community just has no idea that's happening. And then vice versa, there may be things that the community has going on, good ideas that can be put into the process where that's not being taken into consideration. So I know I've said it, you know, ad nauseum on this call, but you know, there's been so much heart and hard work that has been put. There are people that were showing up to these meetings and showing up to gatherings that were literally worried about their safety at the very beginning of this engagement. And so, you know, while this work is to a certain degree very run of the mill, right, in the sense of, you know, coming up with a report, I never want us to forget the lives that these words represent, and the trust that was very much not tethered when we started this process. And not to say that we're all kumbaya right now and hugging on each other, but there is a little bit of momentum that I think, you know, this process has created, and is just incumbent upon everybody who is part of this process to keep that momentum going, so that we don't end up back where we were at the beginning, where it was a process that the community didn't see anything coming out of. So, you know, again, I really appreciate Brian's term that he came up with, a bias towards action. I think we should really keep that in the forefront of our minds and not let everything else that comes into play. There are still many things going on. We're still in a pandemic. We're still having all sorts of issues going on, but just to make sure that, you know, with all haste, that many of these things begin to be worked on, and that the communication is there so folks can see it and feel it. So that's my last little speech, if you will. I don't see any more hands up. So I will give one more round to see if I'm missing anybody. And then I may even be able to.
Joshua Harris too.
Oh, I think that was his hand was up from his last.
I had a follow-up.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay, my bad. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
That Garland is waving his hands.
Oh.
Yes, he is.
Okay.
Just the other quick thing, you know, there's obviously all of the stuff that we have in the recommendation, but Chief and Craig, we had that conversation. And I know one of the things that came out of that conversation was even tweaks to the training, like when there's multiple officers on site, having kind of a point of contact or a person who's in charge of that scene. I know, are there still plans for those kind of internal changes and trainings outside of this? And if there are you also going to be like putting that information out as well for the public to see? Because there's obviously all of the stuff that we could cover within this recommendation within our scope, but there's obviously also the other things that, you know, in that simple meeting between the three of us, we came up with a number of really great ideas. Are we still going to be seeing progress happening on that front? And then is there a way that the community can contribute to that conversation a little bit? Is there plans for those kind of discussions to happen as we move forward?
Yeah, and I'll start, and then if Chief wants to weigh in, I agree, Josh. We had a really great conversation. I think I would back up and just say one of the things I've always been impressed, and I've seen this with fire and with police, is that in every instance, in every situation, whether it's something that has a positive outcome or a very bad outcome, that there's always a process of evaluating a scene, particularly where it involves multiple officers, evaluating a situation, looking at our training. Was our training followed? Are there issues where we need to have additional training? Are there procedures that need to change? Those kinds of things happen in multiple instances with these instances, just as part of their regular practice, right? Of they're looking at what's happening and how they can be better and we can respond better. So those things absolutely are continuing to happen. There's some things I think in terms of what we could communicate out with changes that we're making. Others may get into tactics that you wouldn't really communicate publicly of how we're approaching certain things, but that we're trying to be careful that we're making sure that we're keeping the public and the officers from getting in a situation where we're going to have a bad outcome. And so definitely, I think we need to think about how we would communicate some of those things. But I believe that we should have continued communication just on what we do all the time in public safety, I just think it's part of their DNA to always look at how you can be better and things you can do better with training and equipment and you know, procedures. But I would also add that I feel like, you know, the idea that when we have a project manager that gets selected for this, that we have a continuing dialogue that's available where people can provide input and feedback on issues and topics that they see, that we can still have, you know, that informs our decision making. Having some way that we can continue that kind of dialogue, I think would be very helpful. Chief, did you have anything else you'd add to that?
Yeah, you summed it up very well. I'll just use a more technical term. We debrief all of our incidents that we're involved in and take things that went well, things that could be improved upon, and learn from those. Every critical incident now, you know, anything that involves an injury or something to that effect goes through a much more rigorous process involved and culminates in a training review to determine, are we training things the appropriate way? Are there things that worked in this situation or things that didn't that we need to improve upon? We've also instituted a reality-based training unit, and we also have return to duty protocols now for officers that are involved in a shooting. Whereas before, when the DA cleared them, we used to just put them back to work. And so we've done a lot of these things just within the last 1.5 to 2 years. And how we know these things are working, we're getting ready to put something out. We're putting it together right now. In the last 3 days, we've had 2 instances where we've run across individuals that were under the influence of drugs and armed, had guns in the vehicle. And in both of those instances, they were resolved without anyone being hurt. Everyone went home, and that was the use of less lethal that we've added, more less lethal type of options for our officers. Those are all things that we've done in the last couple of years that, like I said, we're getting ready to put out some details on both of those instances to let the public know and see some of the changes that have occurred and how we're handling these things better. So it's all a process, you know, that we're working through, and I feel like we have made some significant changes, and the training has definitely gotten better, and definitely is improving the way our officers handle things.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, that I feel like, you know, as we look at, you know, we talked a lot about transparency and openness with our data and the number of incidents and providing information, but I think too, we need to do a better job. And I don't mean this as a criticism, but I think the police department needs to do a better job of showing the things that we're doing. We as a city need to do a better job of the things that we're doing positively to try to be better for the community. That they don't do a good job of patting themselves on the back. And I don't think that's the intent, but to say, look, here's some things that we're looking at to try to improve the way we're responding. And so I think as a whole, the department's hired a couple of positions that are focused on helping with that, of being able to communicate more openly, whether it's transparency and accountability, or it's just openness about things that are happening, just like the annual report, openness with information that we have about the police department and the work that they're doing in the community.
Yeah, and I mean, it's great to hear, and I'm glad. I, of course, always definitely want to make sure that we emphasize the public input on these processes as much as possible. Obviously, there's stuff that, you know, the public can have input on and are privy to, and there's things that they aren't. But even with the creation of this task force, you know, my focus to the mayor was open it up to the public, have volunteers from the public, have the ability to apply, to be a part of this process, to be a part of this conversation, because there's always what we can see from our perspectives, even this group, right? And then there's those outside perspectives that are going to help guide us towards making sure that we aren't just talking about the things that we're doing well and patting ourselves on the back like we should be, but we're also being cognizant of the things that are failures and having those criticisms internally, so that we can make sure that we're bettering the system as a whole, but also mending those relationships. I know that, you know, Chief, you work really hard on building those relationships with the community, but I always want to make sure that when I come here, my focus is on the community, and I know that you all feel the same. I want to make sure that the communities feels like they have a hand in it. They feel like they're involved in a process, and they feel like when they speak, their voices are being heard. I think we've seen a lot of this throughout this process, but I definitely don't want to lose it once the task force is gone. I know that, you know, all of us can say that we're committed to that, but it's easier now with this kind of organized infrastructure where we have to come together and have these meetings than it is when this task force goes away. So just cognizant of that. And I know I'm here as a resource. I know many of the others on the phone would, or on the call would say they're here as a resource, but we want to make sure that the community is still involved in the process throughout the longevity of all of the changes that we need to make as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point, Josh. What I also call that is, putting money in the bank. When somebody's going to make a withdrawal, and it's so much easier to call up somebody that you just had a conversation with last month to talk about how do we fix this versus, you haven't talked to them in a year and it's in the middle of a crisis. So I'm going to go to Garland, and then I see Representative Pittman put her hand up. Okay, so Garland.
Yes, Chief, you were making mention of things that were already in the possibility of being implemented. I noticed that in the
Garland, did you by chance mute yourself again? Are they?
Citizen Advisory Board, will it be included at this time? Are you there? Can you hear me?
Okay, you went dark for a second. Well, you asked something about the CAB. What was your question?
My question is, will it actually be put into the police manual at this time?
Oh.
Whereas previously, in other words, we implement something, we put it in place, and then we don't have a manner in which we can hold it accountable, utilize it or scrutinize it or vilify it or strengthen it, help it function in the manner in which it should. So as you're putting policies in place concerning the police policies in general, police manual in general, will anything concerning this CBT be put in there?
I don't think things with the Citizens Advisory Board belong in the police manual, because I don't want that under the police department. That needs to be a separate entity because they're evaluating what we do. And we work very hard to make sure that we are separate. I don't want people to think that we control the Citizens Advisory Board. So that's why it hasn't been in our manual. It's a separate entity. They govern themselves. They have the say on who's on the board and who's not me. So that way, if I don't agree with something, I don't have the power to just pull somebody off the board. So, and I think there's a lot of things to still digest with the recommendations that are in there, but I don't think there's any avenue going forward where the CAB would be under the police department and would be part of our manual.
If not the manual, so now let's think about what we're saying. So now here we'll put something in place, but I don't see us to being able to, at this point, being able to hold them accountable for when they confront the police department about the issues that we have going forward, since we don't have that subpoena power at this point. Do you understand what my statement is?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's just a question of semantics at this point. I mean, I think what you're saying, Garland, is right, that the structure and the responsibilities and the makeup of the board, all of the terms, all those things need to be documented in a manual so that everyone understands. Chief's just saying it doesn't belong in the police manual, but I think it's separate for the CAB that would have like its own policies and procedures per se. It wouldn't be called policies and procedures, but guiding document that would say how it's structured, the number of members, how they're appointed, what their terms are, what the responsibilities are. All of those things would be documented so that there is an accountability.
Accountability as far as what's their responsibility. That's where I'm after.
Sure.
In other words, find things that are not in place, not in order, not as the manner in which they should be. They should be able to implement some form of fashion in order to be able to go directly to that and say, this is what needs to happen, should happen, and ought to happen. And these are the reasons behind why it should be.
Yeah, I think Brian even made the point in the report, in his conversation, his comments, that the board that exists right now, the way it was originally structured, has even additional, I want to call it authority, but roles that it could take that it hasn't proactively taken. I think it's maybe on a great, there's even more they could do as it stands right now. And I think you're right. If we're clear and we're public about what those roles are and what responsibilities are, then everyone would understand that and be able to help with that accountability.
need accountability. That's basically what we're seeking.
Yep, totally agree. And that's one of the things I think Brian might even started the report out that says, you know, the one thing that we heard overwhelmingly over and over and over again is accountability. And so, you know, with the good policies and training, you know, that third step is definitely accountability. So, Representative Pittman.
Hello, everyone. My question is, and this may be just a thought that I had, so point me in the right direction. It's for the city manager. The city has a new diversity and inclusion officer. And my question is, I wonder why she has not been a part of these conversations, or what help she will be to you as you select someone who can receive this information or who can help staff these pilot programs. Because one of the common denominators through all of this, I apologize, one of the common denominators through all of this is that we are dealing with diverse communities, people from diverse backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, people that have been justice involved, people who may have a disability or trauma or anything. That for me is that you have a resource already on your team. And my question is, how will she be utilized in this process of selecting the people who are able to help this process move forward?
Yeah, so I'll start to answer. I keep getting a message that my internet connection isn't good. So if I break up or something, just give me the signal. I'll try to jump on my phone. So Shaylin Jackson is our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. She has a significant challenge in front of her just within our organization, and that's where her focus is. But I will tell you, we pull her in about 18 different directions, because so much of what she does at its core relates to so many other areas. Redistricting for our community, she's getting pulled in as an advisor in that, to participate in that. She's already been meeting with the police department on hiring and recruiting and retention, and the working within the organization culturally. And so she's engaged on that internally within the organization. In terms of what we do as far as a project manager, what we're doing going forward with how we manage these processes, I would believe she would be more in an advisory role, and I wouldn't add another responsibility to her. But she engages on so many different levels and so well, because there's just so much relationship between, like you're saying, it's dealing with different groups that are marginalized or disadvantaged historically or even currently. And it's something that we've got to keep in the front of mind. So definitely she's someone that's always there, that's advising in these different types of activities, and would probably still be in an advisory role on that.
Thank you.
That was a great question. So I thought I was going to give you 10 minutes back, but I took up 6 more minutes of your time. So I don't see any more hands up. You know, as always, if there's anything else that you all want to reach out to us about, please do that through the email. But other than that, shall I turn it over to you to MT to adjourn us, or?
That will be fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
First of all, let me say thank you to everyone that attended today's meeting. Thank you for your input. It is greatly appreciated. And Craig, any parting words that you have at this time, or Kenny?
Yeah, I just appreciate everyone's contribution in this. And I think, you know, doing some final tweaks in the report, a couple of things we talked about today, and then getting ourselves ready to brief the council and be prepared to go to council. We'll make sure that we communicate back to the group when we'll get this in front of the council. It's going to be sometime in December is my expectation, as long as everything keeps moving well, for them to receive the report and actually have the final copy of that. And so we'll make sure we're communicating with the group as we go forward. And I really do appreciate everyone's work on this. And to Josh's point, I want us to continue our our communications that we've established now in several of these specific areas we've already talked about today, where there's people that can engage on certain parts of this. We definitely want to reach out and have that participation. And I just want to again say thanks to MT and his work so far. We'll continue working with him as we're bringing this to the finish line. But I really do appreciate everyone's involvement and participation at this point.
Brian, did you have anything?
Brian, I think he was checking back with you.
No, I mean, I will echo what everybody said on this call. Thank you very much. This was a group collaborative effort. I hope we landed in the right place. I'll tell you, 21CP feels pretty good about it. And thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, everybody. Thank you again for attending the meeting, and I call this meeting adjourned.